All right, in this last video, we're going to cover how to create the same thing that we did in Teams, but we'll do it again with making practices, right? So we'll come over here and we're going to right click and we're going to copy Teams. It has a lot of the work already done, and we're going to just say paste it in, and we're going to call it practice. Okay, in fact, we'll call it practices, like so, and click add. All right, so in this, let's close some of these down. We'll go into routes. We have the delete, the update, and the teams. So we're going to copy all of that, and we're going to just paste it down here. And this one's going to be for practices. So add practice and read practice. All right. And here we will call them practices, practices with an S, and practices with an S. And for the form that we're going to bring in, it's going to be practice form, and it doesn't know about that yet, because if we go and look at our forms, we don't have one there yet for practice. So I'm going to come over here and copy this one, and we're going to make one for practice, like so. And we're going to call it practice form. So practice form, and for the practice form, it doesn't actually have a name. It has a date and a length, right? So practice date and practice length. How long are they going to practice for? Length. And then it also has a new one called teams. So what team? That's basically the team ID, right? So teams is equal to, and it's a select field. So we'll need to add that to the types of fields, and the label is going to be teams, and it's going to be the choices for it. Choices are equal to an empty list, like so. So we'll come up here and we'll just add select field. Okay, so that'll be a drop down. Okay, so here practice date, that's going to actually be a date field. Okay, so we'll come up here, comma, and do date field. That's kind of cool. So we can use the date field part. So practice date is now date field, and it is now practice date is the label, practice date. And we're going to put in a format, since date field has a format. So we can say the format for it. So we'll go format is equal to single quotes. It's like %y dash %m lowercase m dash %lowercase d, like so. And that's going to be the format that we want to actually display it in that date. Okay, that's our kind of display. And then practice length is a decimal field. And again, we don't have that one yet, so let's go up here and say decimal field, and it is actually practice length, like so. And we don't need to have that. Like, they can leave it out for right now. So let's just turn that off. Okay, and then for the submit button is just submit. Let's just say submit. Or we could say like add practice if we want. Yeah, let's do add practice. All right. Nah, let's do submit. I like submit better. All right. The value of just saying submit is you can use it for the add team, and you can also use it for the delete. So if you want to say use this form in the delete, you could just call it in the delete. But okay, so we have our form. We got to come back to the routes, and we're still if we come down to where it still doesn't have it here, so we have to go up to the top and say, oh, we need to make sure we include the practice form. Okay, so we have our practice form. So here is our teams, here is our practice. Okay, so form equals practice form. And then again, if it's a request method post, that's all good. We're going to grab out of that form 3 things, right? So our 3 things that we're going to get out of the form is the length, the team ID, and the length, team ID, and the date, right? So we're going to say practice length. That's just going to be one of the things we grab, okay? And that's going to be right out of the practice length. So practice length, whatever's inside that practice length one we have in the form, okay? Same thing over here, we'll do practice date. And that's just going to be taken right out of the practice date part of the form. And then we're going to do one more, and that one's going to be the team ID. So team ID, and that's going to come right out of the, so request, form, get, and then it's team. And I think it's just teams, because that's what we called it in the form. So if we go back and look, we just called it teams. So it's just teams. So we go back to routes, it's going to grab the ID. So teams is actually made up of two parts, which is what we're going to do now. So up here before the form on practice, we're going to actually fill up that drop down, right? So actually, let's do it after the form. So let's get, we'll do teams is equal to get teams. And we already have access to that, right? So it's going to go out, it's going to grab all the teams, okay? And then we're going to load up, using this dictionary that we got back, we're going to load up the form, okay? So we're going to say form.teams, that's that drop down, and we're going to say the choices. So the choices for that are, and we're going to put it inside this list, and what are we going to put inside that list? So the first thing we're going to say is team, well, let's start with what it actually is. So we're going to put teams, right? So we're going to come out here, we're going to say teams, and it's a for loop. So we're going to say for team in teams, right? So this is going to create a row of this dictionary, okay, for teams. And then we're going to come into here and we can actually say team, and then inside it, we'll say team ID. So the first one is going to be the team ID. Okay, so you got to pass two things into choices. You got to pass in the ID and the name. So the first one is the ID, the second one is the name. And what happens is the first one is what's going to be passed back, but the second one is what the person sees. Okay, so we're going to put a comma and put the second one. So that's the first one. The second one is team, team name. So we'll go team name so that they can actually read it. And then for team in teams. So just like that, that should work. I feel like I'm spelling something wrong. Let's take a look. I do not need this. That all goes inside one parenthesis. So this parenthesis and this parenthesis, it's almost like you're concatenating this together, okay? So there's two parts to that. The first part is the ID. The second part is the name, okay? And that was what my error was. I can tell there was an error. It didn't look right. Okay, so we have loaded up our form. We got the teams. Where's teams coming from? That's coming from our function over here. It says get teams, grab them all, order by team name, okay? And that's being just passed into here. It makes it, and then now we've loaded up our teams. Okay, so we loaded up the choices here. When we pass the form in, we're passing that in also. Okay, so down here, we've got our team ID out of teams. Then we're going to just call that basic, it's actually called practice though, right? So we're going to do practice, which is, this is the query for SQL Alchemy. Okay, and we got to pass in a couple different things. First, we got to pass in practice length. So practice length is equal to practice length. That's going to update that. Do the same thing with date. So we're going to pass in the date. And then we got to do the same thing for the team ID. So we're going to pass in the team ID. So all three of those things are the same in our database. These are the names. I keep them all the same. So that way it happens. Now, if I would have called this something else, it would be changed here. So if I called this team IDs, this right here would have to be team IDs. But this is what's in the database, and this is what the variable is we called here. Okay, so I'm going to change that back. I just like keeping everything the same. And we set this query over here, and I'm going to call it practices. Okay, so it comes back as practices, and again, I'm just going to paste that into here. It's going to commit it. It's going to redirect it back to practices, which is here. Okay. So technically this is a variable and this is actually a call, function call, right? Or like, like a function. So technically it's going to redirect back to the function. And this right here is just a variable that says pass it through all this stuff. So those are not actually the same thing. All right. Then I want to go out and get the practices, get all the practices, and I want to pass them out to the form. So instead of passing all the teams out, which I've actually done here twice, I'm just going to say practices is equal to get all the practices. Okay. So get practices. All right. And then I'm going to pass out the practices. Now, I'm going to actually want to still pass out the teams, which I can have access to here. So I'm going to pass out the teams too, and I'll show you why in just a second. So I want to pass those out. So I'm going to pass that. But I need to actually get this practices done. So I'm going to come over here to functions. Really easy. Def function. And then I'm going to copy this one. And then I'm going to work on the actual structure of this, right? So what do I actually want it to look like? Okay. So when I click, what am I going to need on the practices? I'm going to probably need the name of the college. So that needs to have some sort of join. Okay. So if we go into our MySQL workbench, we can look and see if I do this, I get the name. But how do I add the practice to it, right? So I like to do the kind of the old-fashioned way. So I'm going to put this from down here. And do I need team name, team ID, team name, team mascot? I probably don't need the mascot, but I need the practice date. Okay, so practice date and practice length, like that. And let's just do the old way where we say team is equal to team. So I'm going to go team ID and dot team name, and then I'm going to join, and then I'm going to join it with practice as a P. Okay, so I'm going to come over here and put P here and P here so that we know that's where those are coming from. And then what are we joining it on? We're joining it on T dot team ID where it's equal to P dot team ID. Okay, and if I run that, it's going to say this is the team ID is Georgia, practice date is this date, and the length is this. So if I come over and look at all of them, so let me just make a new SQL. I can just say select all from practice and just run that. It says there's only 2 practices there. And what it does is it just says basically where the team IDs is put in that. Let's go back to that first query. So it says what the team is for each one. Okay, so that's basically a join. So what I would do here is I would just copy that, okay, and I go back to my function here, and I would just paste it in here, and that's going to return me back almost like a view. Basically, this is going to say, give me all of those practices. So because this is coming past this line right here, I kind of like to go and just hit enter, and it's going to automatically put this in. Now, there will be a mistake. Sometimes if you leave do not put a space here afterwards, you'll get an error. Okay, so there needs to be a space, because what that's doing is it's concatenating it right next to this F right here, and it puts it as one word. So just make sure you check that your spaces are there. Okay, and this is going to return this whole thing. Get practices is going to make this thing called practices, and what you're going to get back is these names: the team ID, team name, practice date, practice length, and that's what you'll be able to use inside the practice.html. Okay, so let's go take a look at that. So in practice.html, we're going to call this practice management. All right, just kind of give it a little bit of info. We have our messages. That's all fine. Over here, we'll just call this practices and add practice. And here, it's going to be add practice. Okay. And what we're not going to do in this first modal, notice we don't use any of the variables yet. We can't use the variables until we get down to here because we don't have them yet, right? So down here, it's going to be for practice in practices, and practices is what's being passed in, right? So practices, okay? And we're going to say team name, practice date, and then the length. All right, so copy that one and just put in the length will be the one that we want. So length, like so. And then we can't use team here because we've now called it practice. So we're going to have to make that practice and practice, and here is going to be practice date. Practice date. All right, and let's make one more real quick and call it practice length. So we'll just come over here and get rid of this last little bit and do length like so. All right, so if we just stopped right here, it still wouldn't work because we haven't defined team anymore. We removed team. So this practice needs to be updated down here, right? So let's come over here, and it's not going to be team ID anymore. Down here, this is not going to update the team. We want to update the practice. So remember, it's practice ID, right? So we need to go back to our function and say, we don't just need team ID, we also need to add one. In fact, I'll show you what the error is in just a second. So I'm going to go back to my practice, and here I'm going to say practice and practice. I'm just changing them out, and then I'm going to call this practice ID. And it's going to throw an error. It doesn't know what practice ID is because it's not one of the columns in the actual. So change that out to practice ID. Now, so those two have to stay the same. This is the update model, and we're going to update the practice, okay? And what are we going to pass back? We're not passing back team ID. We're passing back practice and practice ID so we can update that practice ID. So I'm going to come over here, update that, and right here is going to be practice ID, okay? And we're going to call practice update, not team update. So practice update and practice date and practice length like so. And we're going to have one more, right? So let's copy this, come down here, and our last one is going to be team. We'll just call it teams. All right. So that's our, and this is throwing kind of an error because it doesn't like them being the same, okay? And we got to change all these out too. This value is what preloaded into this update thing. And so that's done. Let's come down here, and this is going to be, again, practice. Let's actually pass all of that in. So we'll just take that, come all the way down here, and we want that whole thing to get passed in, which is nice. And then right here, it's just practice name. So that practice name is going to be, actually, I don't think there is one called practice name. So we'll just say, are you sure you want to delete this practice? Something like that. So we don't have to use it. And then we can come back up here, and it's, actually, let's copy that whole, this end part here, and let's just put it in here like so, and in here. So both those have to match up. Remember, this is the button and this is the modal ID, okay? So it looks like we're just about right. We got our form. It's not team update. It's practice delete. So practice delete, passing that into practice delete. We'll need to build those in the route. Okay, so we come up here. Our delete is done. Delete looks really good. Okay, so let's just go through the things that we changed. Here's our button. We changed the practice ID here. Practice ID there. We also changed it to delete. We got to change that to delete practice instead of delete team. So delete practice, that's just words. Come down here. We're sending it to practice delete, and we're passing in practice ID. Okay, so let's make sure our update's a little bit harder. So in our update, we want to actually do another select for teams, right? So we have our label, that's fine, but we want to do a select instead of this input of a text. We want it to be a drop down. Okay, so our teams, so here we'll just call it teams. Here we'll call this, let's just make sure this is right, right? So we'll do practice length. Okay, I'm going to copy that and put it in here so it looks good, like so. And then here will be practice date. Okay, like so. And this is just HTML for a form. You can look it up on any of the HTML things. And then the type, this type here is text. It means a text box, but this type here is a date. Okay, so we're going to call that a date. Okay, because it's, oh, actually, this is the date, and this is the text. All right, good. So we have our text box, we have our date, and then here is going to be practice date. So I can come over here and copy that, and I can just say this is just practice. All right, that's going to preload that date into there. And then here is just practice length, like so. And that's going to preload the amount of time you already had in there. So let's work on this dropdown. The dropdown is a select, right? So we can go select, okay? And the ID is going to be equal to teams, like so, just like what it's been called up there. And the name is also going to be equal to team. Actually, we're going to call it teams. I like teams better. Okay, so we can turn that. All right, there's our select. Inside our select, we're going to have two different options. The first option, okay, first option is the one that's actually selected right now. And then the second one is going to be in a loop, right? So our first option, the value of the first one is Jenga, right? Practice dot team ID. Okay. Now what that means is the value is the ID. What is shown between the options is the name, right? And we're going to actually just add the word selected. Not selected equals true. It's just selected. So that is, if it says selected, that's the one that's going to start. Okay. So option. So you're going to have a whole list of these options of all the different teams. That makes it a drop down. The one that's selected is going to be the first one, and it's going to be the team ID. But what shows up in between option and the option end tag is the name. So we're going to Jenga that, and we're going to go practice and then dot team name. So that's the name that's going to show up right there. We'll just Jenga that like that. So it'll show up one time, and that's coming out of this practice here. Okay, so this team name, which is what we call it, practice team name. Now, we need to do a for loop here. This for loop is going to go out, and remember when I said we're going to pass in teams? So we're going to pass in, we're not just passing in practices, we're also passing in teams. And that teams is just getting all the teams right here. So it has a list of all the teams in alphabetical order, actually. So we're going to go back here and say, you know what, we're going to use that. So we're going to say Jenga. Now remember, if we're just using a variable, it's this. But if we're going to do like a function, we do the parentheses. So we go Jenga for team in teams. That's what was passed in. Okay. For team in teams. And then we're going to do this option thing again. Kind of cool. And instead of practice, which is the dictionary up there, we're going to use this dictionary here. So we're going to go team ID, team name. So we're using this variable to load this up, okay, in a for loop, and then we're going to end the for loop. So like this, and just say end for, just like that, okay? So that's going to load up this team, okay? And like so, very good. Okay, so we have that done. That's going to load up teams. Now, here's our practice and practice date. Okay, so let's take a look and see what else we need. We're going to need to go back to our routes and adjust our two routes. So we have, this is practice. Okay, we come down here. We never updated the team update and the team delete. These both need to be practice update and practice delete, right? So practice update, and if I copy that, I can just put it right there. And practice ID, not team ID, okay? Because we're not updating the team, we're updating the practice. And I'm just going to put that all the way through, okay? So there's practice ID. Down here, this becomes practice. We're going to use our, query builder for that. So practice. And here it's going to be a singular practice, right? So practice. And then I can take that and say practice. And I actually like just this here. So I can just copy that is the length. So I can take that there, and I can grab this one is the date, and I could put that there. And then I need to do one for choices, right? So I can say practice dot team ID, not practice ID, team ID. Team ID is equal to, paste this in and just call it, I think we just called it teams, and it's going to grab the ID out of teams, okay? And then this is practice date, put that there, and practice length, put that there, okay? So let's look at this. We have our practice update. That's what it's called in the URL. We're passing in practice ID. We updated our little practice ID, and we're calling practice, okay? It goes through, adds all those three things into it. And then down here, we just say, the practice has been updated. So let's just do that. The practice is just the Flash form. And we're going to redirect it back to practice. And I think it's practices. So let's come up here and look. Yeah, practices. So we're redirecting it back to practices. And at that point, update is done. The practice update is done. And let's do the same thing for practice delete. So we're going to come over here, grab practice ID, put that in there, put it in here. So we're actually going to use it and put it in here. So it's there, practice ID here. And then down here, we're going to change this to, instead of team, we'll call it practice delete. Okay. And we'll just copy that, put it there. Okay. And then down here, we're going to actually query practice. And I'm pretty sure it's a lot simpler to delete the practice because you don't have to do the, you don't actually have to do this other part here. We're just going to say DB query practice where practice, and it's not team ID, it's practice ID because you don't want to like try to just delete the teams that have the same practice ID, right? So we want to just say delete practice ID, and we don't need this extra part because we don't have to resynchronize it. It's just going to delete that practice. Come in here and say the practice has been deleted, not updated, and redirect back to practices. All right, so delete is done. Let's double check it. It all looks really good. Okay, so update is done, delete is done, and add is done. Okay. What are we missing? Let's just run it and see. So we're down here. Looks like it's all okay. Got this warning, but it does look like it's working. So I'm going to come up here. We're going to hit refresh. I'm going to try to log in. Admin and Pepsi. Sign in. All right. And if I go to practice, it doesn't do anything. Why doesn't it do anything? Because it's taken it to just #, right? So I need to go back to my base file here, and I need to actually say, hey, when you click on practice, you should go to practice, right? So I'm going to copy this little bit of URL4, put it right here where this little # was, and just say go to practices, like so. All right, now I'm going to go back to it. I'm going to hit refresh, and I'm going to come over here and say practice. Let's hit refresh again. Oh, this right here is not the 127. This is the 127. So this one is actually out on the server, and I never committed and pushed it up, right? So this is the one we want. So I'm going to come over here, hit refresh, come over here and click practice, and it should throw an error, okay? The error has no attribute team name, okay? So let's go find out where this team name is. If I click on it, it'll tell us, looks like right here inside the form, there's a thing for team name, okay? So we need to take a look at that and see in the forms what's going on. Yep, the practice form has no team name. So let's take a look at that. Let's go here and go back to our top form on practice. Up here. Yeah, so up here we never did it, right? So I just kind of skipped through this. So let's actually fix this. So this is our practices, and we're going to add a practice. Let's spell it right just for fun. And we added practice here, and we needed whatever this is called, we need to actually call it here too. Okay, that's our modal. So otherwise it wouldn't work, right? Add the practice, come down. When we're done, send it to practices. Okay, and then we have the hidden tag. Here is, I think it's practice date. All right, let's just make sure that it's right. So the first one we're going to do is practice date. That's the label for it. And then practice date. And inside that practice date, we're going to call the class date picker. So it'll actually look cool, right? So date picker, like so. That way it'll actually have a date picker that shows up. It's kind of cool. And then inside this one, the second one will be the length, right? So practice length, that's the label for it. Make sure I spell it right. And then again, practice length. And that one's done. So we want to do one more, and that's the drop down, right? And that's actually a pretty easy one. So I'm going to paste that in, and let's back this up. Something like that. And we're just going to do a label for it, and that is teams. So we're going to take the teams label, and then we're just going to do teams. And that's all we have to do is teams. We don't have to say anything else because it's just going to put that right in there. So let's go back and run it, and let's see what that changed. So come over here, hit refresh. Okay, and it says practice form has no team names. Okay, so let's go and take a look and see where we're still messing that up. So come down here, URL for practices, practice, teams. All right, I think that actually looks pretty good. So I'm going to close some of these down. Okay, let's come into the forms here and make sure that we have this right. Practice date, practice form, practice date. Those all look really good. Good, I can close that. Our models look really good. I can close that. Our base looks good. All right, let's go back to the route. In the route for practice, we're going to send in the practice form. That's good. And then practice, lots of practices. That's good. Okay, let's just give it a second. And you know what? I'm going to end that and Flask run again. See if we can't get a fresh Flask run. Okay, and then go to practice. All right, Jenga app form practice object has no object for that. Let's keep troubleshooting this. All right, so in this, it looks like we're getting a team name. Form team name dot label is on line 59. So let's go back and look in practice. Open up practice. Go to line 59. And I don't have that. Practice date. You know what? If I go back and look at my routes when I copied it, it's right here. So when I copied it, I sent practices, and I'm rendering the template teams, and I'm sending in forms into teams. I really need to be sending it into practices. Wow. Sometimes you get a little bit like you need to make sure that you're sending them into the right places. Okay, so double check those. Okay, that was a little bit tricky. I was a little bit confused. So now we can come over here, and we're actually going into practices, which is good. Okay, so it showed up. The team name, practice date, practice length. Let's add a practice and see if it works. So I'm going to pick a date, okay, and I'm going to pick a length, and the team is going to be Georgia. Okay, so it shows up, and it looks like it worked. Okay, now let's try the update. So I come over here to update, and let's look at things. First, the date didn't load. The date should have loaded, but the date didn't load. Okay, so if we just right-clicked and looked, view page source, come all the way down here where the form is, right, for update. Here is Georgia College and the date. And notice how the date is coming in. It has the date and the timestamp. So what you have to do is go back to your functions and simply say right here, simply say date, go around, put it around it. It's going to say just take the date out of that date and just call it practice date. Just like so. All right, now when we go back to it and go back here and hit refresh, okay, now it knows what the date is, right? It also cleans that up a little bit already. Then I can say when I click update, it knows. It knows that it can bring in that date because it's in a date format. If it was in a date with a time, it doesn't know that, right? So that's one thing you can do inside your SQL statement to make it a little bit cleaner, okay? So we have that. Let's try the update. So I'm going to come over here and change it to, say, 32 minutes. And click submit. And it says URL not found, practice update. Okay. And if you look here, it's missing the 1. It should have had a 1 or a 2 or something like that. So that's the problem. It doesn't know, because in your route, let's go back to our route. In our route, it said for update, here's practice update, you were going to include a number, and we never included a number. Okay, so we have to include the number. What's the number supposed to be? The practice ID. So if I go back to practices and I go down to where update is, which is right here, I'm saying, hey, send in the update. So right here, practice ID. So if I go back and look in practice, which is that dictionary, right? So if I go back and look at the dictionary, it should have a practice ID. So if I go to functions, which is where the dictionary is built, right here, I don't see practice ID. So I simply just have to say comma p.practice ID and make sure I have that space on the end. Okay. And if I do that, now it's going to bring that back into the dictionary. It knows where that column is. The whole thing was built around that one practice ID. I can come back and I can go back to here and I can refresh that page. Okay. Just to make sure when I click update, change it to 32 minutes and click submit. It changed it to 32 minutes. I'm still not liking this whole red thing. I have to figure that out. But it changed it to 32 minutes. Okay. And I could also go in and hit delete. I can delete one of these practices. Are you sure you want to delete this practice? Yes. Delete. And it's gone. Okay. So if I go to teams and I want to add, I've added this team here. If I go to practices, I can add a practice for that team. So I can come in and say, hey, tomorrow for 33 minutes, Atlanta's going to have a practice. And then tomorrow on the 29th, they're going to have a 44-minute practice. Atlanta is. Okay. If I come over here, notice what's happening. Okay. First, I'm updating this one here, right? On update, what should happen? This should say the date, which it does. It should say the length, but it's not putting the right team here. It's taking the team Georgia College. Okay, so something is going on. It should say Atlanta, right? Atlanta's here twice, which means it was right. It was right here, but it popped Georgia College at the end. So let's do that again. Let's see if so. This one does say Georgia College. This one says Georgia College. Okay, so it's taken the very last one. So if I go back to my practices and I look at my my select statement here, okay, what is it that I did that I shouldn't have done? Right here, I shouldn't have added another selected, okay? That selected says pick this one. So every single time it goes through that loop, it's going to, oh, now pick this one, now pick this one, now pick this one. Get rid of that selected, okay? And it will start with the one it actually is, okay? So let's run that again. Actually, we'll just refresh it, okay? And I'm going to click update down here in Atlanta, and now it says Atlanta, and all the other ones are still here, okay? Very good. So that looks just about right. The only thing is that we want to check is if we go back to teams and delete the Braves, is it going to delete the practices for the Braves also? Okay, so I go back to teams, I hit delete on the Braves, I go back to practices, and there are no practices there also. And if I go and I can double check this, right? So I can go into practice and I could run it. There's only 2 practices left. Okay, one for Georgia, one for Georgia College. If I go into teams and I run it, there's only 2 teams inside my MySQL workbench. Okay, so that's another way you can use the workbench to double check what you have going on. So we've covered a lot in this lesson, this lecture. Okay, we have our submit buttons. All of this works. Okay. In our functions, we built in our functions here. Okay, remember our spacing at the end of this, and we have our DB Connect. So that one's good. And at this point, I think this app would be considered just about finished as far as being able to CRUD. If you have any questions, we will hopefully answer them in class or put them in the comments.